Hello. It's the 2nd of October, 2015, and this is the Unseen Podcast, episode 27. I'm your host, Paul Carr, and this is a special episode tonight where we have three special guests. We have two so far. We'll hopefully have the third shortly. And the topic is going to be Mars One. As you might recall, a few weeks ago, we did an episode called Mars One and Its Skeptics, where the panel were harshly critical of Mars One. And then Ryan MacDonald, who's one of our guests tonight, wrote to me and said, well, I have some problems with some of the things that were said on the podcast, and I would like to respond to those. And so I invited him to come on and talk about it and tell us about why he wants to be a Mars One candidate and why he thinks it's going to be a success. And since then, he recommended two other people to come on, and we've invited them as well. So we'll have up to 3 Mars One candidates here. Before we get started, I'd just like to say a couple of things. This is, of course, as you know, a spinoff of the WOW Signal, except unlike the WOW Signal, it is unedited, unscripted, and completely open participation. So, but the WOW Signal is moving ahead, and we just had an episode out with Andrew Siemian about the Breakthrough Initiative, the Breakthrough Listen Initiative for SETI. I hope you'll listen to that. And just yesterday, I put out a WOW Signal burst, which explained at a very elementary level why interstellar travel is hard. Coming up, we'll have the big focus the next month or so is going to be on asteroid mining, with some people who are quite expert on that, as much as you can be an expert on something nobody's ever done before. And also on interstellar travel with, I'm hoping to have Dr. John Rather on, who'll tell us about his concept for ultralight interstellar probes and lots of other things as well. He's got quite a lot of interesting ideas. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to like to introduce our panel. Well, sorry, our special guest tonight. And we'll start with Diane McGrath, right? Hello, Diane. Tell us about yourself.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for inviting me on to join you guys tonight. As you mentioned before, I'm one of the Mars One astronaut candidates. So there's obviously still as a candidate, there's a few steps to go yet, but cross fingers. My background and history, how I got involved with this, I currently work as a sustainability consultant doing research, my PhD in the area of food waste in particular, and I have an expertise in not just sustainability but environmental management, so soil systems, hydrology systems, and very much into closed-loop food systems. That's kind of my area of interest, but also energy when I used to work for the government, as well as pharmaceuticals and immunisation when I worked in that sector for about 12 years.
Right. Just a minute, Diane. There's a lot of noise. Is that Oscar Mathews? Did you just join us?
Yes, I did.
Oh, okay. Pretty noisy on that end. Oscar, please mute your mic when you're not speaking, but I'd like you to tell us a little bit about yourself before you do that.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Sorry I'm just a few minutes late here. I'm Oscar Mathews. I'm a civilian engineer on F-18s at Naval Air Station Pax River. As a reservist, I do flight tests at the same place. And I'm a Mars One candidate. I fly. I love everything about space, and I've always been interested in exploring and settling a new planet.
Great. And finally, the guy who got this all kicked off for us after the last episode, Ryan MacDonald.
Yeah, hi there. I'm Ryan.
I'm sorry, Ryan, we're having trouble. You're breaking up a bit. Can you start over, please?
Just recently, last year, completed a master's degree in physics.
Okay, go ahead. Oh, we may have lost Ryan. Give him just a second to get it back. Can you hear me, Ryan? Okay, I'll tell you what. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panel while we're waiting for Ryan to get his link back. Then we'll let Ryan introduce himself. Okay, so the panel tonight, I've all been on before, so there's no need for any lengthy introductions. We'll start with Adam Synergy Smith. Good morning, Adam.
Hi.
Hi.
Good to be here again. I'm looking forward to talking to these guys.
Yes, and Antonio Paris. Can you hear me, Antonio? We may have lost Antonio.
I'm here.
Okay.
There we go.
All right. David Grigg.
Hi, how are you? Good to be here.
And Patrick Festa.
Hello again.
Okay, now all these guys have their bios on unseenpodcast.com, so please feel free to check that out. And they've all been on before, most of them multiple times. So Ryan, are you back?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you just fine. So Ryan, tell us about yourself.
Okay, great. So with regards to, so about myself, I'm one of the UK's Mars One candidates, one of 100 around the world at the moment. I've recently completed a master's degree in physics at Oxford University, and currently I'm working on a PhD in astrophysics at the University of Cambridge, where my area of speciality is exoplanet atmospheres, trying to take us one step closer to understanding habitability of.
We lost him again.
I think we just lost Ryan again.
I can actually introduce Ryan if you want me to.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, everybody. Well, Ryan MacDonald is basically starting his PhD at Cambridge in astrophysics. As far as I know, we're pretty good friends. As far as I know, he's interested in exoplanet hunting, and he's basically just an all-around physics and expert. His master's was at Oxford. Yeah. And of course, he's British, and he's a Mars One candidate.
Right. Okay. Now, Ryan, you're back. Hopefully stable.
Yeah, well, I hope we have better connection on Mars, to say the least.
By the way, Ryan, if you're, I'll have to have you on the WOW signal sometime to talk about exoplanet atmospheres. That would be something that would be interesting hearing about as well.
Yeah, sure, I'd love to.
But tonight we're talking about Mars One. So if you haven't gone to Mars yet, we'll talk about that. So Ryan, this all started when you sent me an email after we had episode 21, which, by the way, was hosted by James Garrison, who's probably out there listening, but he has lots of small children at home, so he can't always host. But our panel was very harshly critical of Mars One, and you wrote to me saying, "Well, there's some things in it that you guys said that were factually incorrect. And I'd like you to maybe we start with those things, and we'll build from there." So over to you, Ryan.
Okay, yeah, sure. So the first thing that thanks. Yeah. So the first thing that really struck me when listening into the episode was about
I think we lost him again.
Oh, this is bad.
We did lose him again, but he'll be back. Hopefully he's not depending on university IT people to connect.
He seems so clear.
They tend to take weekends off. Okay. Okay, he's back. Okay, Ryan, we see you again.
Oh. Am I back now?
You are back. Yes.
Yeah, so terribly sorry about that. So aspects of the selection process. So one of the things that, and it's fair what a lot of you were saying, because there are a lot of misconceptions about Mars One going around that you have to dig a bit, unfortunately. And part of that is Mars One's fault, because there could be a lot better PR and outreach. But the big thing that struck me was that it was claimed that audience voting was what was used in order to actually make the selection for all of the candidates to get to this stage, when there hasn't been any aspects of audience involvement, any kind of like online voting to select people, because you don't select people to go to Mars based on who's going to be most popular or who might work best on a reality TV show. And that was the second point, in that although it's popularly reported that Mars One is intending some kind of Big Brother reality show on Mars, that's not at all what it plans to do. What Mars One is working on is a documentary series, which principally is about ensuring transparency in the selection process and the training of the astronauts, and engaging the public to excite them about space exploration. And then the third other thing that I really picked out was about how Mars One was being funded. It was claimed that basically all of Mars One's funding comes from crowdfunding, when it is true that around $350,000 has gone towards Mars One from crowdfunding. The actual lion's share of Mars One's budget comes from private investors who are investing in the project, mainly for a return on investment in the broadcasting rights of the said documentary series that we made for it. And so up to this point, there has already been 30 angel investors which invested in Mars One back in 2013. And at the moment, Mars One is actually trying to close and work on a $15 million investment deal, which is mainly in order to effectively conduct a series of early pre-phase A and phase A conceptual design studies.
Right. Now, Ryan, I understand that you may not be able, or you may not even be privy to do you know how much funding is involved so far?
Well, all I can say at the moment is that there will be a press release issued when Mars One is ready to make that announcement, which currently is projected to be around the end of this year.
Okay. We'll wait for that. Okay. Now, some of the other things that were discussed in episode 21, can you sort of give us a rundown of things that you took exception to? We understand there's not a reality show now. In fact, the reality show that was planned has fallen through, and it's not going to happen. So there's that's on hold at best. What else is that we said that week did you take exception to?
Right, there was also issues that were raised about effectively the thing that I really took issue to, and I think probably Oscar might want to say some things about this as well, was about this perception that all of the people who've signed up for Mars One and are involved in the project are kind of just naive people who don't have any comprehension of the risks that are involved in the actual wanting to go to Mars. When one of the key requirements, and actually one of the things that we were tested on quite extensively in the rounds in the selection process leading up to this, were primarily risk involved, testing whether we understood clearly the risks. Because, I mean, you have to be clear, this is a risky mission. There are huge risks. And so checking that people are clearly aware of this and are able to consent to it, and you have a reasoned thought process behind why they're willing to accept those risks, was a big part of the selection. So I don't know, I took issue to just hearing that we're all just naive people who, I don't know, just want to be reality TV stars, when that's not what I want to do. I'm a scientist, and it's science that drives me more than anything else.
Right. Now, let me ask you a follow-up to that. Some of the criticism I've seen has been that that Mars One is a bit of a pyramid scheme. Have you been asked to invest much of your own money in this project? I understand if you don't want to answer that question, but
right. So right off the bat, the only monetary investment that was required in order to be involved in Mars One was initial application fee, which varied based on the GDP of your country. I believe the average was around $38, which was in the United States. The highest was $73, which was for Qatar. The reason that was put in place was basically stop crazy people just applying on a whim. That was the idea, so that you're only getting people that are applying that are actually serious about it. And obviously also because Mars One does require monetary resources in order to complete conceptual design studies. But then, of course, it was adjusted by GDP to make it so that it was a kind of small token barrier that anyone could afford. That was the logic behind it. But apart from that, no, there's no kind of monetary investment or anything that's involved. I've seen it obviously repeated quite often in certain corners of the internet that the candidates who paid the most to Mars One are the ones that got selected. And you can actually immediately refute that by going on Mars One's website, ranking the candidates by points, which is a kind of gamification system that was created in Mars One's online community platform in order to reward people who had contributed to Mars One effectively with voting rights on key mission decisions, such as which payload will win the university design competition, for instance. But you can immediately see that candidates that have passed into the current 100 candidates, there's many amongst those who have not contributed anything financially to Mars One, apart from the initial application fee.
Right. Now, all of you, Diane, Oscar, and Ryan, you're a level 3? You've been selected for the third round. Is that correct? Or
that's correct. It's round 3, semifinal round.
So you've been through 2 rounds of selection.
Yeah, that's correct.
So
yeah, and one of those was a medical round, I suppose.
Oh, so there's a medical round, and there's how was that round? How was that selection process done? Was that based upon your resume or an interview or something like? Diane,
no. Well, I was just going to field this one because it's kind of a misconception to think that the selection process is done already. And just to clarify it a little bit, because it's a 10-year select out process, we're still candidates. We won't be astronauts if the mission even happens until the mission gets us into space. So when people say, well, how did you guys get to the selection phase? How did you get selected for it? We're still being selected for it.
So
we got to this point by basically completing the initial application, which is the oft-repeated 202,000 plus individual who started the application process. There were a lot of crazies despite the application fee that Ryan mentioned. So Dr. Kraft and his, I think he had 3 people in addition to himself on the committee looking at these videos. They had to weed out a lot of people who were clearly not taking it seriously. And they got that number down. I think you can read this on the Mars 365 articles that are out there, 360, I think. But they weeded those numbers down to like 80,000 applications essentially, or videos plus essay questions. And what it is we had to answer essays on why we wanted to go, a bunch of different questions they posed to us. We had to make a video on our sense of humor, why we were the ideal candidate, things like that. And we also completed a few brief psychological questionnaires online, in addition to finally, a few months after that, getting a roughly 15-minute interview via Spark-Hire and I guess in some instances Skype, so that all 660 candidates at that point could get interviewed worldwide. And that was just with Dr. Kraft, which I thought was pretty impressive for one person to do that. But like Ryan mentioned, all the questions and Dr. Kraft's emphasis during that face-to-face video interview was to get a sense of whether or not we understood and had informed consent on the risks of the mission and what we were being asked to do.
All right. Diane, you wanted to add a couple of points to what Ryan said?
Yes, and also I think I can probably expand on some of Oscar's points there too, especially about the interview process. And there is a video online that Dr. Kraft has put up that explains the 8 interview questions that he asked all of us. And Oscar is absolutely right. Half of them were technical questions that really helped us illustrate that we understood some of the technical risks, such as radiation and so on. And then the other half of them were more personal questions to see if we understood from a different perspective what the risks were, as in how we would deal with some of the personal challenges of isolation, and how we understood what the mission's vision was, as well as how our role would be within a team. Because, obviously this is this is not just a technical mission, it's a human mission. And so that aspect of working together and teamwork was critical, and those sorts of things came out through that interview process, which I thought was interesting. Having I've worked at global corporate levels many times and interviewed many people for employment over the years, and these were the sorts of questions that I expected to have for such a significant and serious operation. So there were no surprises for me in this, I guess. I get one of the other things that I just want to add, just from what Ryan was saying before as well, about I think the funding aspect of things. From myself, people can see that I've, I suppose, not quite donated, but I've purchased a lot of merchandise, and that's mostly because I do talks at a lot of schools. I like going into schools and helping educate kids on space science and get excited about science, especially young kids and young girls, to be continuing their own personal journeys of science throughout school and beyond. And so I tend to buy for the schools. I'll buy a poster, a Mars One poster, and I'll sign it, or some stickers for the kids as prizes and so on. So any points that I have up there have been entirely from giving away stuff to schools.
Right. Now, Ryan, I'm looking. Let's see. There were a couple other points you wanted to make about what we said a few weeks ago. And I think I'm missing them right now, but would you like add anything to what you've already said? Because if not, we'll go right to questions.
Sure. So there was one thing I want to add is that so the selection process up to this point has just been a select out process of people who are not suitable to go to Mars. And crucially, we've only been tested as individuals up to this point. The online interview that we had was mainly testing our ability to, I mentioned previously, of course, being aware of the risks, but also to be able to reason, to be able to
We've lost Ryan again.
I think if I could chime in here, I think
Sure.
that Ryan was about to start to discuss that the next round of selection, which is rounds 3 and then round 4, will be around assessing how well the candidates who are left can work as a team, and the aspects of how they solve problems, how they deal with things going wrong in a couple of different environments. So round 3 that I know that Oscar started to mention before will be a series of group challenges that will be held over 5 days, in which the candidates will be put into groups of roughly about 10 to 15 people to see how well they do manage to resolve problems as a group and the sorts of dynamics that occur there. And once again, Dr. Kraft and the team will select out the people that do not seem to fit into the team or into a team environment. And that each day of those 5 days, they'll be selecting out between 10 and 20 people roughly. And that will bring down to 40 people that will start the round 4 selection process, which will occur immediately after conclusion of round 3. And those 40 will go into essentially isolation chamber testing to see how well they deal with things going wrong, but under extreme duress. And so they don't have the same sort of levels of support or access to their normal environment. And that will once again see how well they do deal with problems when they're under a lot more pressure.
And that isolation experience will be approximately 9 days, which that can be debatable as to whether that's sufficient to test. But another I guess avenue to sort of corroborate what both Ryan was probably going to talk about and what Diana was just now is Mars One in the Curiosity Stream documentary that just came out called Destination Mars has Bass himself has said, and so has Dr. Kraft, that they're not sending the best people, individuals to Mars. They're actually sending the best teams. They're trying to send the best teams to Mars.
Right. Now, how many? It's going to be 4 people on each flight, right? Or is that correct?
Yep, that's correct. It'll be four person teams. So
the first flight would be 4 people, followed by slightly less than 2 years later, 4 more people. Is that how that works?
Slightly more than 2 years later. So 2 years and 2 months later, there'll be a second flight. And Mars One has indicated maybe some flexibility in terms of crew schedules, depending on what the sparing resupply logistics problem looks like going forward.
Now, wouldn't it make sense, since you've got to be isolated together for a very long time, months, plus when you get to Mars, you're going to have to spend a lot of time in this small shelter together. I'm sure you've heard of Mars Desert Research Station, and people who go to Antarctica and spend the winter, in this little cramped place. Would it make sense to put your team in that kind of environment for a long time, or is that going to burn you out?
No, I think that's a perfect. Oh, go ahead. I was going to say that's a great idea, Paul, because when you look at NASA's High Seas mission, for example, in Hawaii, which I'm part of the reserve crew for that. When me and the rest of the people went out to the Grand Tetons and were going through survival training, the NASA survival training for the year-long mission, we learned a lot about each other, and it's one of these things where if we could subcontract out maybe the NASA habitat or an MDRS habitat or something for even more than 9 days, I think that would be useful. If they could themselves create Outpost Alpha on the timeline they've set up for themselves in a location that's like MDRS or the Antarctic or the Arctic or Hawaii with the basalt-rich volcanoes that they have out there, then those would be terrific analog environments to try and isolate these individuals, individuals like us in, so they can actually see what these team dynamics would actually be like.
Right. Now,
and may I just add? Oh, sorry.
Apologies. Go ahead, Diane. Go ahead.
I was just going to add during the what would be essentially 10 years worth of training leading up from the closure of the selection rounds to the first crew going in what's at the moment estimated to be 2026. And each year of that training, the proposed schedule of the training program would see that each of the crews go through some isolation training for about 3 months of the year or around. That's at the moment what's proposed. So you would sort of see this kind of that sort of training that you referred to there taking place each year, where the crews would then test and play out the sort of things that they've learned that year, from technical perspectives to team dynamics to some of the personal training. So which is I think really important, because otherwise you're not going to actually really be able to assess how well these individuals can work with some of those challenges of isolation.
Because you may love each other after 1 week, but after 3 months you might hate each other.
That's right. Think about how sometimes on the weekend you get a little bit crazy, even with some of the people in the family in the households, or if you share houses, someone that leaves the light on in the room, it's like, turn it off. It's not that hard.
Yeah. I don't know the specific challenges that Dr. Kraft has in mind, but he's already indicated in several videos that his idea of a challenge is going to be way worse than anything we could actually ever experience on Mars. And significantly, he said that there's a chance, in his mind anyway, that no team will actually complete the entire 10-year process.
Well, so is it going to be like the SEALs? If you can't make it all the way through, you're gone, or do you?
Actually, each year through the selection process, what Dr. Kraft is proposing as well is the team that's the most underperforming. So we'll have, from the end of September next year, when rounds 3 and 4 conclude, there'll be 24 people left who'll be put into 6 teams of 4 that will start up to 10 years of training. And each year, one of those teams of 4 will be selected out because they're underperforming. So that's going to drive this fantastic, I suppose, culture of collaborative, competitive nature, but what it will also do is make sure that everyone's focused, and those that are selected out, Mars One will be doing an intake of new candidates to put new teams forward as they go through as well. So there'll always be a bit, I guess, as you know, NASA is always having intakes of new astronaut candidates as well, to make sure you've got a pool of people who could potentially, go forward with any particular mission. And that's what Mars One's goal is, by the end of 2026, to have at least up to about 6 teams or so. Any of the teams could be ready to roll.
I understand. Now, I want to get into higher level issues. I'm not sure you folks are the right people, but we'll save that for later, about like who's going to pay for all this and how many rockets do you need and so on. But Antonio has some questions. I'd like to let Antonio's done some research on survival in outer space. So I'll let Antonio start with his questions.
I had a different question first I wanted to pose. Most of the work and research I've done is for select in or select out astronauts is they're looking for people that can bring multiple skill sets to the table. They're not looking for a PhDer who spent the last 30 years just in engineering, or the physicist that's been doing physics their entire life. So what is it that each of you guys can bring to the table that what multiple skill sets will benefit you in hopes that you guys will actually make the cut? What's your background other than your PhD or your current careers?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. It's actually the advantage of being a little bit older. I'm 46, so you tend to have the opportunity to have a number of different careers potentially. And I also have 4 university degrees, and I'm doing my PhD currently. So my areas of when it comes to technical expertise from education range from mathematics, was my first degree, and literature, and then I went in and did marketing, so communications. But then it's been sustainability and environmental management and environmental engineering has sort of been, the more recent focus over the last few years. But that's the education side of stuff. From my career and technical skills, I started out in the pharmaceutical industry for 12 years, and I've moved through a number of different areas, including medical and as well as through project management, and was a global person in charge of the portfolio of vaccines. So my understanding of, I suppose, physiology and the body's response to immune system issues and so forth is quite helpful, I guess, in many areas. I worked with the Australian government for 5 years in the energy sector, and during that time I helped manage some energy, like an energy program in energy storage for renewable energy, and then I was also involved in working with the Australian government for its forecasting for our energy future, like how do renewables fit better within our current energy grid and so on. And beyond that, I've also been working with emergency services. So I used to manage a team that did an emergency response for disasters, so disaster relief with the Red Cross, as well as worked with the Australian government in developing some of the disaster response initiatives for the things going wrong with offshore oil and a lot of other major resource problems. And my current work that I do is in sustainability, in particular with food systems. And I'm on the board of a few not-for-profits that are in sustainable food and food security. And so, and even in a couple of weekends' time, I'm doing a workshop with permaculture design. So I grow stuff.
Well, we definitely need people who can grow stuff on Mars, as Matt Damon's character just showed us in The Martian. Okay, well, I'll try and keep it short. I'm an Eagle Scout, so I don't know if that tells you anything. I love the outdoors, and I am comfortable in cities, but that's kind of my background there. I went to the Air Force Academy after I became a citizen, and kind of following in my family's footsteps there of military service. And my idea was to fly or somehow get into engineering and become an astronaut, even at that point. I graduated and got a slot into specialized undergraduate pilot training, so I flew for a couple years in the Air Force. So I have operational jet time under my belt. And unfortunately, I had a family issue, and so I got a hardship reassignment into combat logistics, so I didn't fly anymore. So I could take care of that. Took care of it, and I did 3 years in combat logistics as a 21R logistics readiness officer in the Air Force. I wanted to go into engineering, but they had some differences of opinion on that. So I got out and I got a master's in aerospace at the University of Tennessee. Did my research at NASA Ames on particle saltation physics and Aeolian two-phase dynamics on Titan, and with Dr. Line there at Tennessee. And once I graduated, I at the time I heard that NASA was working on a deep space nuclear reactor for long duration missions. So I got interested in nuclear engineering. I went to a job fair at Tennessee, and there's a person there from NAVC. I was actually trying to speak with NAVAIR and Lockheed Martin and a couple other companies. But he convinced me that submarines were a lot like spacecraft, and we had a pretty good interview, so I got hired on as a nuclear engineer. So I learned naval nuclear power, nuclear engineering at Naval Nuclear Power School, and I did nuclear test engineering for S6Gs. Well, really, I've been on all reactors, but S6Gs and A4Ws primarily, because I swapped over after about a year and a half on subs, because they were hurting for people, because they have a vicious personnel problem, trying to retain people on carriers. And after about 3 years in nuclear test, one of my old XO from the Navy Reserve job that I have as a flight test engineer, he approached me and he said I'd be a good fit for F-18 system engineering. And so now I'm an aerospace engineer for weapon systems integration on the E-18G Growler. So I'm working on the next generation jammer for that. So it's been kind of an interesting career so far. I'm working for NavAir, which is what I originally went to try and get out of that job fair. And I'm working on tactical aircraft, which I think is one of the coolest jobs anybody could ever have, even if I don't go into space. And I'm a Mars enthusiast, obviously. So if I get to travel through space and try and sail Mars, then that would be the completion of that dream as well.
Ryan, I don't know if you heard, but he's still there? Oh, he's gone again. Okay, well, I guess. Sorry
to interrupt, Paul. And I'm currently a PhD candidate in aerospace engineering for spacecraft shielding at Old Dominion University.
Oh, okay. Antonio, any more questions? You're muted, Antonio.
There we go. Just one last question. What there are inherent risks of going to Mars, and I know you could probably look at multiple websites, and the debate continues whether we can actually physically survive the trip. What worries you the most? I'm sure you guys done your studies, everything from radiation, nutrition, psychological hazards, spacecraft malfunctions, being deserted. If you can pick one, what would be your worst nightmare, and most importantly, what would you do to prevent that, or what would you do to actually survive that?
Ryan, you want to handle that one?
And Diane, you could go first.
Yes, Diane.
Yep, I'm happy to go first, no problems. I've worked in risk management a long time. Some of the stuff I did with the Australian government and since has been around doing risk assessments and putting, obviously, mitigation tactics and so forth in place. So for me, when I first heard about the Mars One mission, I didn't apply for a couple of months because I did my own risk assessment first on exactly those sorts of things. What's the technical risk of this? What about the health risks? I'm an athlete. I run marathons and so on. So for me, being able to be physically healthy is really important. So I did a lot of assessment on the health risks that astronauts would face for a long duration space flight, but also for then being in 38% of Earth's gravity, different atmospheric pressure, et cetera, so all those sorts of things. And so for me, when I finally put my application in, I guess I'd taken that risk assessment and made an informed decision that, all right, the technical risks, there's so much you can prepare for in 10 years for training, a bit like how NASA astronauts prepare. You practice things going wrong constantly. So I'd expect that we would constantly train to practice things breaking and fixing them and breaking and fixing them and work through a number of different scenarios. So I'm not concerned about technical risks because sometimes if something goes wrong, that's how it is. It just breaks. And some things you cannot fix, and that's just life as it is. When it comes to the psychological aspect of things, I think actually the health aspects, I'm not concerned too much about a lot of the health aspects. And in fact, I've started doing a lot of extra preparation now. Like I'm very aware about the bone demineralization and the loss of musculature and the vision problems, all of these sorts of things. And so I've actually started to try and build up my own baseline now so that I'm in better shape than I already am in 10 years' time. So I'm laying down more osseous mass. I'm increasing musculature, all these sorts of things now. And I'm aware, obviously, about the sorts of things that you can do to minimise the impacts of that while you're in space during that sort of travel at like they do on the ISS today. Obviously, they exercise for prolonged periods of time, and there's nutritional aspects that you'll need to consider, lack of vitamin D, lack of exposure to the sun. How do we get that? Food, plus also through supplementation. But for me, I think the biggest challenge is going to be the psychological stuff. I mean, we can train as much as possible to be ready for that. I grew up in the outback in the Northern Territory, so I don't know if any of you gentlemen are very familiar with the Australian outback, but it's a big red desert. And so I've spent the age of 10 to 17 in this red barren desert. And so I kind of have an understanding of, or I expect I probably do, of what that sort of barrenness will be. But I think the challenge of isolation would be the lack of immediate physical contact with people who are important to you in your life. So that sort of isolation, as opposed to being disconnected from people in general. So it's the intimate stuff. And so for me, I've started doing preparatory work for that already. I see a psych every couple of months, and we go through a training program already where we start to look at the areas of risk and loss, and how people might treat you if you do pass away, so those sorts of things. And I've met people who live in solitary environments today to try and learn from them, from Antarctic workers, who I know a couple of, Arctic explorer, the homeless, actually, very isolated. Very sad to say that sometimes, like one homeless person I spoke to not long ago said he can go a day, 2 days with nobody looking him in the eye, which is just terrible. And I've also spoken with a number of prisoners who've been in solitary confinement to work out how they deal with being in that box with very little human contact at all, sometimes for years. And that's been extremely educational. I'm trying to apply a lot of those lessons to my life today. But I know that the Mars One mission will allow us to have go through a number of years of training on these sorts of aspects. But I think that even when you get there to Mars, if I'm lucky enough to get to go, if the mission proceeds as planned, then you're never going to be able to prepare for everything. You can do as much as you can, but there'll be that moment where you think, okay, what do I do now? And I guess that's where you hope that your personal resilience toolkit is strong enough for all the years that you've been dealing with things going wrong, that you can get through it. And I guess the team will have worked together for 10 years by then in training to be able to support each other through what's going to be, I'm assuming, an incredibly difficult 10 years. It won't all be sun and roses. And I think that we'll probably help each other through that, even though there will be dark days like any time in our lives, really, and every day we have. I think that probably the thing that will be the hardest will be, for me personally, will be not taking on other people's dreams. If I do get to be in the first crew or the second crew or one of the crews that gets to go to Mars, I mean, do you go there on behalf of humanity? Is that part of it too? Do you take humanity's dreams with you? How do you deal with the psychological aspect of carrying that sort of almost expectation with you? So for me, that's the stuff that I think is going to be the hardest, is that living up to expectations, probably.
Well, I'm impressed at how much thought you've given this. Ryan, did you want to weigh in on what risks are concern you the most on the journey?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me all right now?
Yes, just fine.
Excellent. So for me, the risk that really concerns me the most would be the risk in something going catastrophically wrong during the entry, descent, and landing sequence, where, as we know from previous missions to Mars, that has been where the lion's share of really the failures has taken place. Now, to a certain extent, you can, of course, mitigate that risk by using the same or very similar landing systems for the human missions as previous demonstration missions. But you can never remove that risk entirely. But part of the aspect that it's not really so much the personal risk that worries me the most about that. It's the risk that if something went tragically wrong during the first human landing on Mars, what could that do potentially to set back any future human endeavors? And I think that kind of level of existential risk is much more worrying to me than personal risk.
Right. Okay. Oscar, you have anything to say about that?
Sure. I agree with what Ryan said 100%. Entry, descent, landing right now is probably the most critical area that needs to be further researched in my mind. In terms of the risk to the first mission, I think an important distinction needs to be brought up between the NASA send a 40 metric ton lander and try and land that somehow on the surface of the planet Mars, which they they won't be able to do for a while, if ever. But what that mindset tells me, the NASA mindset tells me, when they say they want to try and land something that's the 10th the size of the ISS on the surface of Mars, in effect, trying to land fully formed buildings on the surface, is that they don't understand that if anything were to happen to that first mission, which it's likely to happen, whether it's 40 metric tons or 8 metric tons, but the risk is higher, and if they lose it, not only is it higher, if they lose it, then they lose the entire program. The Mars One approach is, I think, on balance, very cognizant of spreading the risk out across multiple capsules. And so you're testing all the same technologies up to and including the crew capsule. So you have 6 capsules plus the crew capsule and a bunch of unmanned and satellite missions before that, which of course some of those don't land, but you're proving the technology in a stepwise fashion, and you're not risking everything on one landing or one launch or one single point failure. In terms of your previous comments on other risks, in terms of the flight there, the 6 to 8 month flight to Mars, spacecraft radiation is an issue, but we have forecasting technologies at this point that can help us predict when the astronauts will be at risk of a solar particle event, which those only happen maybe 1 out of every 2 months. So we're only expecting a few of those on the way there. But if you have a dedicated shelter inside the spacecraft, yes, it will be uncomfortable. Yes, we will have to select people that will be resistant to the psychological pressures that such close quarters contact will have. But if you look back on the history of human exploration, humans have been subjected to close quarter contact of that magnitude, and here we are.
Right. I mean, the Polynesians had crossed the Pacific in canoes, right? For hundreds of miles.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Now, I'd like Patrick. It's your turn.
As to that, having the right people, Paul. I think we do have the right people. I'm very impressed with these the candidates' credentials. But my question actually is about the preparedness and of the equipment, actually, of the spacecraft itself. I've always wondered. In fact, I've actually outspokenly said that if NASA themselves are not prepared to send people to Mars by the date that your Mars One is proposing to do, like 10 years before NASA was going to do it, I'm very, I guess the word is skeptical as to believing that they will have a ready spacecraft in order to do this for Mars One before NASA was. But now that you mentioned it, you're talking about you've actually studied at NASA Ames and all that, so you were actually the right person. I'm sorry, Oscar, to answer the specific question about spacecraft. I'm a layman, I'm not a scientist in any way, but I was wondering, are they really going to do you think that they're going to have a ready spacecraft with especially the radiation shielding and all that you were talking about in time?
So I'm not sure if it was my connection or yours, but I actually missed the question.
Go ahead and repeat, Patrick.
I'll shorten it. Are you certain that a spacecraft of is going to be ready? In other words, you're planning to do this 10 years before NASA was planning to even orbit Mars with people. How can Mars One send groups of people to Mars to land to live there, when we're not even certain that we have the capability of building the proper spacecraft for this? This is basically what I'm saying, and you are the right person because you obviously studied at NASA Ames and all that stuff. So I was just wondering how that is possible that you think that you're going to be ready before 10 years before NASA was going to be ready.
So to answer your question, it kind of requires a multi-part answer. The first part is that the structure of the mission plan is totally different. So the one-way nature of the mission plan means that you don't have to have, for example, a Mars ascent vehicle that you could see on the movie The Martian. that is a very high mass system with a very complicated and complex technology we don't actually have tested and definitely not tested in a relevant operational environment, which is the TRL 5 to 6 level that they're looking for the risk levels that they're willing to accept, which are incredibly low, and I think almost too low in my opinion. But of course, that's a discussion on risk that could easily take up in another podcast entirely. But when you talk about the mission plan, there's that portion. The second part is the technical solution that NASA has come up with to land on Mars. As I mentioned earlier, is a high mass. I mean, 40 metric tons is 40 times what we've proven so far. Mars One is saying that because we're only trying to land between 6 to 8 metric tons on the surface, that it is very feasible if you look at the delta masses that we need to try and overcome within the timelines that we have, that we don't need revolutionary technology, we just need evolutionary technology to catch up.
The Curiosity rover weighed around 900 pounds, I believe.
Is 1,000. Yeah, that's right.
So you're still talking about untested technology. Nothing heavier than that has ever landed on Mars.
Right. So, in other words, the question really is, I mean, before people even get there, they have to make sure they have habitats either built or the equipment down there to start building. Or I'm just not sure that anybody can do this 10 years before NASA was even going to start doing it. I just don't understand how. I mean, you talk about entry, descent, and landing, and all that technical stuff, but what about when you get down there? How are you going to start building these habitats? I mean.
Well, you're absolutely right. So entry, descent, landing is the problem right now. The solution, which NASA is working on, it could be in the form of the low density supersonic accelerator that they're testing in conjunction with the Navy over Hawaii. That right there is testing payloads in excess of 3.5 metric tons. So, you want to talk about how much more capability we're going to have in 10 years. Well, we're already planning on doing 3.5 times what we initially landed with Curiosity. So I don't think it's a stretch, and I think it's a disservice to our engineers to set the bar so low that the only expectation we have of them is something that we've done 10 years ago, for example.
Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm not asking right. In other words, I think there was a report done by the SETI, an idea that in steps, just like we did with the moon, you send people out in orbit and then come back.
That was a planetary society. Yeah.
The Planetary Society. I'm sorry. Yeah. You send them out to orbit and then come back, and then you test that. You in other words, you take steps to find out what can go wrong, and you come back and then it takes more than 10 years to do all these things. And again, what about the habitat? What about when you do land there? Are you going to have equipment already landed there? Prior to before you get there. In other words, stuff that you're going to meet down on Mars, be ready for you to start building. Or
Diane is nodding. Yes.
I'm happy to. I'm not a technician, so if you don't mind, I'll just be able to speak to what I understand the Mars One plans are, the technical roadmap at the moment. Before the first humans are going to launch in what's planned to be 2026, Mars One plan is to have a number of missions go prior to that will absolutely be delivering that sort of payload that you refer to, Patrick, where they'll be landing a number of modules which will essentially be the habitats. So they'll land in advance, and if we send smaller items, that's much easier than trying to land something which, as Oscar sort of noted, would be something which would be a tenth the size of the ISS. So if we could sort of manage that risk of that launch landing challenge by sending off a whole lot more smaller items, and then once they're on Mars, then they're able to be put together essentially. And one of the items, or two of the items that will be sent prior to the Mars One astronauts first going in 2026 will include 2 rovers, and those rovers aren't going to be the scientific rovers that we see and understand today, like say Curiosity and Opportunity and the historical rovers. More of a robotic, I guess you could say, and their roles will be to drag a lot of those habitats into place and do a lot of the preparatory work under instruction, obviously from Earth, and so that when the first crew do arrive, much of the infrastructure, the basic infrastructure, is already there, and the first humans, we understand, won't be sent until there's a signal back from Mars to Earth to indicate that yes, all of these missions have landed successfully on Mars.
Exactly. There'll be 9 missions total, 6 of which will actually be landed missions, 7 of which will actually landed missions, 2 of which will be satellite missions. The point is, orbiting Mars is not the problem. We can orbit Mars. The challenge that NASA has that Mars one does not is we don't know how to keep people alive for that return trip. That's essentially the problem. The recycling technologies, all the systems that need to be maintained for double the length of time have not been maintained in that environment. So that's NASA's problem. Getting through landing is both NASA and Mars One's and SpaceX's problem. And there are, like I said before, lots of technologies that are being developed right now between heat shield technologies and inflatable technologies and supersonic retro thrust technologies and a bunch of other things.
What about the radiation technologies, the radiation shielding?
Sure, and that's actually a specialty of mine, so I think I'm adequately able to answer that.
That's why I was asking you, yeah.
Right. So radiation shielding is a laggard technology. I think most people haven't been sufficiently developing it for the past maybe 50 years, since really the 60s. There's a brief period where superconducting active systems kind of gained notoriety, and then it went back to an emphasis on passive systems with boron and nitrogen and a bunch of other things, which are really just lightweight versions of what we used or are using in naval nuclear power for low energy radiation. So, of course, the energy spectrum is a lot higher. The atomic numbers are a lot higher. The radiation shielding has to deal with a couple of new things, but essentially we're solving that problem, and it's not a showstopper, in my opinion. What I'm coming up with is a novel technology for essentially reducing the number of secondary events once a particle craft. It's passive shielding, so you don't have to worry about superconducting, but it also doesn't allow the particles to interact with matter. So it's actually, I think, got a good chance. It just needs to be developed because right now that TRL is very low. If you don't use advanced shielding, and you just use normal, boron impregnated or normal aluminum or anything like that, 40 centimeters. So basically, the standard spacecraft structure of composites plus aluminum will give you adequate protection from normal solar particle events. So your solar protons and things that are coming off the solar wind. You're not going to be able to stop the galactic cosmic rays because those are coming from supernovas and it's isentropic, and you would need on the order of an active system, on the order of 15 Teslas or something. Not 15 Teslas, but I think Ryan and I calculated this out. Basically, to change the direction of a GCR by more than like 30 degrees, you would need something on the order of the equivalent magnetic field in the interior of a neutron star or something absolutely crazy. And the problem is there just aren't that many of them, and they're not that as a fraction of the total radiation dose. They're not something that we need to be concerned about. We need to be concerned about. Well, let me just finish up. Sorry. We need to be concerned about protecting the astronauts from the solar particle events that we can adequately forecast. And to do that, we just need to have them go into a shielded section of the spacecraft.
Ryan, you had some follow-up on that.
Yeah. I've noticed a lot of the discussion about the landed mass of the capsules and the current position of technology. As was mentioned, of course.
Afraid we lost you again, Ryan. Okay. Why don't we go ahead to David's question, and Ryan will be back soon, I'm sure. Go ahead and unmute your mic, David. Your mic is muted. I can't hear Ryan at all. I'm sorry. Can anybody else hear? I can't hear anybody. Hold on.
For now, so Mars One envisioned being able to land 2.5 tons on Mars. That was the entire basis of their plan originally. It was actually inspired in part by the Red Dragon study, which was commissioned. Although Mars One currently are looking more towards Lockheed Martin for designing landing systems. However, Mars One at the moment, they're more like a think tank. They're raising money to do conceptual design studies to try and figure out the technologies required to put humans on Mars. And one of these that was published, I believe it was in July, was on the life support systems that will be required for Mars One. It's publicly available. You can check it out. It's an eclipse designed by the Paragon Space Development Corporation. And the key takeaway from that is that it looks like Mars One underestimated the mass that will be required for life support, and it will probably be more around 5 tons, most optimistically. So Mars One obviously has to iterate and improve on their design based on the feedback they're getting. So the next step is Mars One is actually going to be working with Lockheed Martin to design a new landing system to see if you can actually accomplish this 5 metric tons using supersonic retropropulsion, as has been mentioned before. So the point I want to get across is that this is an iterative process. Mars One is very much learning alongside everyone else. And it's my hope that, if anything, what Mars One is doing at the moment is putting funds into commissioning design studies, which, by being publicly available, will hopefully, at least I hope, aid anyone who is planning to do a mission to Mars in the future.
Okay. David, you had some questions?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay.
David, you had some questions?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yep.
Yes.
I had a comment, and that is that I don't think we should ever bet against the development of technology. I mean, don't forget that America landed a man on the moon in less than 10 years from the first commitment that they were going to do that. Don't forget that we went from the Wright brothers flying the first aircraft to landing on the moon in less than 70 years. Technology is amazing the way it develops. But that wasn't the question I had quite a while back. wasn't really about the technical aspects. I personally feel that the technical aspects can be overcome. They're very challenging, but I think they can be overcome. My concerns are to do with the human side of things, and Diane's very ably talked about the psychological training and the training of the teams and so on. But that's what worries me. Jean-Paul Sartre famously said that hell is other people. And if you've got a group of 4 people, however well they've trained together, stuck in very close environment for a very long time, there are going to be personal dynamics that change and shift. And there could definitely be situations where you get 2 people against 2 people or 3 people against 1 person, finding that there are conflicts happening, and that would be very difficult to manage, I would have thought. And I know that they're going to train together, but what happens even if you train together, but one person has to drop out of the team? What happens then? How do you reform a team, perhaps close to the actual launch? So those are my concerns.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that if you like, David. The question, I guess the first one about the preparation, you're absolutely right. I mean, the human being is the most unpredictable of all machines, I think. You're right about the technology advancements, the way we see technology advancing. If we look at 3D printing, for example, there is no doubt that we can all envision that 3D printing is going to have to be an aspect of any sort of mission to Mars, no matter what it is. And what we see today is going to be extraordinary in the future. But the human aspect, how can we get that right? And you're never going to get everything right because humans are this unpredictable beast. And so I think that managing some of those aspects of conflict and so on, as much as you can train a team, there will be times when there'll be things that go wrong. And I think it's how the team is able to rebound from that. And by trying to select the right sort of people, trying to go through training of that, but also having good resources available for the team when they do get to Mars. What sort of psychological training do you have? Apparently there'll be training for members of the team to be able to deal with things from the psychological perspective, not as in personal training, but technical training. As you're aware, with such a small team, whoever gets to go is going to have to be trained on almost everything from medical procedures to dental procedures to fixing solar panels to growing the food, and also in relation to psychology as well. So theoretically, we should have at least one or two people within the team who have got some basic psychology training, as well as access to resources from Mars One and Central Office to be able to help deal with some of those problems. But I don't think you're ever going to deal with everything. I think you're absolutely right. There'll be moments when the crews will be challenged. And I think when we see the crews increase in size and that the size of the colony get larger, we'll have the opportunity to be able to deal with some of this a bit better when you have more people and you can work with others to try and resolve problems. And that will occur every couple of years, as Oscar highlighted earlier, when each new crew comes every 2 years, 2 months. So where there'll be 4, there'll then be 8, and there'll be 12, etc. So there is a lot more opportunity to find, resource in more people. But I think some of the stuff you can do yourself is around, a lot of it sounds quite, maybe new age or whatever, but the meditation aspect of things. Some of the things I've been learning from the prisoners I speak to, especially those who've been in small cells with large numbers of people, have been around giving me advice on how to deal with some of this, has been around find ways within yourself to try and create space and have a communication with your colleagues that indicates to them when you need time out as well. So how do you deal with those sorts of aspects of communication? It could be as simple as someone picking up a book and that's their cue to everyone else in that team. Diane needs some time out now. We'll leave her alone or she's going to go nuts. But also within yourself, like how do you, when you're in that 7-month journey from Earth to Mars, when there's undoubtedly going to be days when you've got nowhere to go and you just want a bit of space, how do you turn that space inwards and make sure you can find that space within yourself? Because that's going to be pretty much probably the only solutions you have, because you can't go out for a stroll. You can't go out for a run. You've got to find it here. So the more training that we can do around that to improve our own, mindfulness in some ways and an awareness of others' needs personally is going to help that dramatically.
Okay.
Well, I wanted. Oh, go ahead, Paul.
No, go ahead, Oscar. I think Ryan also wants to say something. Go ahead.
Well, so this question comes up quite a bit, and I think it's interesting and it's very important to address. But of course, we have social interaction problems here on Earth, and as Diane pointed out, it would be more difficult to generate space between the settlers. But I don't think it's impossible. I think I maybe just disagree a little bit, or maybe it's a phrasing issue. But the outside radiation exposure for a 3-hour EVA every 3 days, I think, is estimated to be around 11 millisieverts per year. So if you convert it, it's like just over 1 rem per year, which, depending on the type of radiation, is totally manageable from a human factors perspective. So you could, I think, it is in my opinion, I think you could go out on a stroll on a fairly consistent basis, and you could seek some of that away time from the close quarters confinement with other people. But again, as she mentioned, meditation or self-reflection, any of those things would definitely be helpful. And again, you're selecting people who are adults and who are specifically trained in conflict resolution, in addition to maybe perhaps having a doctor who either has psychology as a specialty, or who might actually just be a psychologist.
And just to answer the other part of your question before, David, about what happens to the team if somebody pulls out, because the dynamics, you're absolutely right, the dynamics will change quite dramatically. So what Mars One has said is that during the training program, the 10 years, if somebody, it could be for personal reasons that they drop out, or it could be for health reasons too, or life circumstances. Or you can't predict what will happen in somebody's life. They may decide they want to have a family at the last minute, and that may change things quite significantly. So Mars One has said in those instances that whole team is removed from the program, and so those candidates who have been training and are still, still committed, can then go back into the pool and basically reapply to be in the pool of candidates to build a new team to go back into the training program again. Because once you've you've trained maybe so long potentially as part of a team, you can't just remove one person and put another one in. You're absolutely right. The dynamics, they're going to change so significantly. And we saw that obviously with Apollo 13, even from a health risk perspective. You can't just pull one person out at the last minute and stick someone else in. You have to make sure there's another team who are ready to roll to be able to take that place. So Mars One are quite cognizant of that and have sort of planned for that within the 10-year training program to make sure that the teams get to train for the 10 years as a team throughout the entire unit of that process.
People do die, of course. Over a 10-year period, someone may have a heart attack, may get hit, have a car accident, any number of things could happen. So if someone has to drop out like that, it could be very traumatic for the rest of the team who perhaps see that their chances of going are vanished.
Yeah. Ryan, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, there's just one thing that I want to add, because the person who's running Mars One's selection process and also the training, Dr. Norbert Kraft, is a very interesting character, particularly because he's actually served as a mission commander in a simulation mission that was undertaken for Roscosmos. And the interesting thing about it is that almost everything on a psychological level that could go wrong in that mission went wrong. Two of the teammates started like a bar brawl, and there was sexual abuse that went on. A team member quit. And yet Dr. Kraft just kind of sat there almost bewildered, like not understanding where all this was going on and what was causing it. He wasn't bored or stressed or anything. And so what I like is that he has structured and organized the isolation chamber. And it's actually one of his specialities, one of his favorite areas, actually, deliberately to try and cause conflict and to try and break us. In fact, he said to me that he wants Mars to be a venerable paradise in comparison to what he's going to put us through in the training, such that if there is even the slightest wavering doubt, or indeed if there is an undercurrent of psychological incompatibility between people, he wants to prize that out into the open and identify it as early as possible. So I like to think that if we can put up with that for 10 years, then what can Mars throw at us? That's a nice thought.
All right. Now, I have a question, and I'd like to sort of, I know you guys have thought about this a lot, so you should have some kind of answer. What's the best case outcome for Mars One?
The best case outcome for Mars One is that we generate more than $6 billion, that we establish very strong partnerships with SpaceX and schools, universities, and NASA around the world, get people excited about the mission, and successfully land 4 people on the surface of Mars in 2027, and sustain them until the follow-up missions and so on and so forth.
Okay, now let's talk about the so on and so forth. What happens after that?
Well, eventually, the idea, so Mars One's stated goal is to have a permanent human presence on the surface of Mars. And what they want is for that colony, that settlement, to be as self-sufficient as possible, as early as possible. And just like the London company is not still supplying, axes to the United States of America, eventually Earth will not be supplying needed raw materials or food items to that Mars colony.
Okay, so you would have to be able to. Does that mean eventually having families on Mars, children?
I mean, theoretically, here we are looking at establishing a colony. So this is an outpost of humanity on another planet in our solar system. It's one of the goals of the Mars One mission. It's absolutely about permanent settlement. And we've seen this every time we see explorers go and go to a new country on our planet to start afresh somewhere. And there are a number, obviously, as you're all aware, a number of people who have some scientific background that do believe that we need to be an interplanetary species for the potential survival of our species over time. But that's another point. I think when it comes to having children, that's something that is recognised that eventually will have to occur. But Mars One has said that they don't want any of the early crews to have children to start with. There's no evidence that a fetus is going to carry in low gravity or in microgravity, 38% of Earth's gravity. We don't know what will happen through female reproductive systems in that sort of environment as well. We don't know about the development of an infant and so on. So there are so many unknowns that Mars One have said, it's not safe essentially to start with until we can see that it is safe. Say, for example, through animal husbandry. Once we see through animal husbandry that an infant can survive and thrive, then Mars One of basically saying humans for humans.
Well, will there be women of childbearing age on the early missions? Do you think is that possible?
Well, if we think about the age of the current candidates and the fact that we'll all go through 10 years of training, the youngest candidate's 19 at the moment. So, and they're actually two women, and they'll be 29, 30 by the time they go. So there'll definitely be women of childbearing age, but that could potentially be in that first crew. And then, of course, there'll be people potentially who may not be of childbearing age anymore, such as myself. I'll be 56 and have no intention of having children. I don't have any now, and I shan't be having any further. However, I can recognise that could be a risk, and so everybody has to consider what they wish to personally do to mitigate that risk. And I know that's one of the things that does get asked about as personally as candidates. Would we tend to reduce that risk for ourselves? Would we go and have histories? Yeah,
vasectomies all around, or
I don't think it's not something that's been formalised from Mars One at all. But I know that people do get asked about that at some of the other candidates. For the gentlemen, obviously, but for women, we get asked the opposite. I get asked about, which is interesting because would you ask other people that you don't know if they'd go and have a vasectomy? Possibly not.
Yes, I can see that could be awkward. And Tony, you had another question.
Yeah. Okay? I'm muted. I really have hopes for you guys, and I hope that it's, perhaps maybe all three of you guys make the selection. But I'm a little not too optimistic on the timelines that these guys set up. For example, their very first, goal, their stated goal is to have a lander in the year 2018, and that's basically just around the corner. Paul, help me out here. You're the spacecraft engineer. It takes years to build any of those things. But anyway, just looking at the next possible launch window for Mars is in 2016. In fact, I have the date right here. It's March 11, 2016. And it's obviously you guys not going to make that one. And then the next available launch window is mid 2018. So do you guys feel comfortable with that timeline that you're going to miss the 2016 launch window, and then the next launch window is mid 2018? So basically, for those Mars One people out there listening, you should be building now, and that's a concern that I have.
Oh, okay, I'll comment on this. So at the moment, Mars One actually pushed back that first demonstration mission in March of this year. It's currently tentatively scheduled for 2020. The reason being is that, firstly, it's worth mentioning that the demonstration lander would ideally just be effectively a replica of Phoenix and also of InSight. So it's somewhat tried and tested technology. The current deadline that Mars One is working to is that they need to have commissioned and paid for a Phase A study with Lockheed Martin by spring 2017. That's the current schedule that they're working for. And that would actually be included in the current $15 million deal that Mars One is working on. So in terms of the overall timeline, I certainly think that with funding the 2020 demonstration mission is feasible. I, of course, have my own doubts about the rest of the timeline and whether all of that will go according to schedule, which is principally driven by funding. Mm-hmm. Just the first demonstration mission would cost around $400 million. Then it's an order of magnitude step up moving throughout the rest of the missions. So 2027 for Mars One is an aspirational timescale if everything goes according to plan. And in aerospace, when has anything really gone exactly according to plan or on budget? So I think you have to accept that there could be delays, and I'm certain that there would be, but take it on a case-by-case basis, milestone by milestone. And for the time being, 2020 for the first demonstration mission. Yes, I think that can stick to schedule.
Okay. Anybody else?
I'd like to have a follow-up question. it kind of goes back, before we get off the subject, it goes back to the radiation shielding. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Oscar, did you suggest that they're actually working on an active system, like I guess it would be a magnetic system, or using superconductors? Did you actually suggest that, or did I misread that?
Oscar, can you hear us?
I'm sorry, I apologize. My connection is obviously not 100% here.
I think he asked you if you're working on an active system with a magnetic field. I think your answer was no, you're not.
That's correct. Mine is a passive system, but it doesn't operate like a traditional passive system because it uses nanotubules. Basically, at the nanoscale level, it prevents matter interactions.
Oh, okay. So it's not an active magnetic system, because that's what I was asking.
Correct. It's almost a passive subatomic Lenz's law application.
Oh, if you have any links for that, Oscar,
I've got the link and I'm posting it now. In fact, NASA just posted that here about the nanotubes too. So there it is right there if you want to read it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, anybody else have any questions, or shall we wrap up now?
I think that was a pretty good discussion there. I really appreciate you guys. And
can I just
go ahead?
Can I just have a couple of comments?
Sure, Adam.
First of all, I do totally understand why these people would want to go to Mars. I've been fascinated by Mars myself ever since the Viking landing missions of the 70s. I love Mars. I take a great interest in everything that goes on the surface of Mars. I follow the Curiosity rover, the Opportunity rover, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. I pay a lot of attention to a lot of the science that's being done on Mars. But I have no interest in wanting to go there. There's too much for me to give up. You know, I'd be giving up my family. I'd be giving up seeing nature. You'd never see another animal. I live by the sea, and I love the sea. You'd never, ever see the sea again. Are you really willing to give all that up?
Who wants to take that one?
I'm happy to respond first. I think everybody probably has their own personal trade-offs when it comes to when they applied for the Mars One mission. So I can't speak for Oscar or for Ryan. And so I guess when I did think about, do I want to apply for this mission? When I first read about it, I was incredibly excited. A bit like yourself there, Adam. I mean, the idea of space and the technology that's come through it and following what's happened over the years. I mean, I was born the day before Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, and I lived through that era as a young girl through the challenges and all of the rest of that period too. And it was really exciting. You really could see humanity in space. And it's been a shame, I think, that the last decade almost, when it almost feels like not a lot's happened, which is not true. I mean, a lot has happened on the ISS. We've seen so much research and advancement, and we see a lot more collaboration between space agencies and so forth. And technically what we see in the private sector coming forward, it's been quite dramatic. It's just not a lot of publication of it. So it has been there, but just very quietly. So for me, I'd like to be a part of something which is it's so much larger than myself. I sort of think back, how can I try and show an analogue of something else in history, and it makes me think of perhaps some of the early explorers that thought there is something out there. There is something excited and exciting about this opportunity, and I'm prepared to put my hand up. Someone's always got to be the one who's prepared to put their hand up and prepared to take that first step. We would never have the advances in technology. We would never have our understanding of the world as it is today, or even what we know about the solar system, until somebody first said, I'll have a go with that first. So I don't mind being the person who's prepared to do that. And I've spoken a lot to my family about this and how they feel about it. And my mum has been so wonderful. When she first heard about it, she was extremely excited, because she thought that her daughter could be potentially a part of mankind's next great leap forward, like what happened when obviously Armstrong stepped on the moon. And then doesn't like the idea of the one-way bit so much in some ways, because of course I'm her only daughter, so the idea of losing her daughter to a planet, not so exciting. But then when she realised that we could probably communicate still through internet and through video messaging, she was all right about that, because I used to live in another country, in Belgium, and we used to just write letters to each other. So she went, oh, okay, I could do that. That's all right. And so that sort of aspect I'm not too concerned about. I'd probably get through some of those difficult moments knowing I can still communicate. I think your point about nature, Adam, I'm a runner, so I love being outdoors. And where I run in Melbourne, there's a family of kookaburras that I run past when I run early that greet me in the morning. So those aspects of things I think will be challenging. But I guess when I look forward to what's on Mars, when I see the future and the opportunity in the future, I see a different world which I can learn about and I can be excited about and participate with as well. I mean, who wouldn't want to stand on the edge of the largest Grand Canyon or canyon in our solar system? I think it would be extraordinary to see. And as an athlete, to be able to run a lot faster than I do here on Earth, just because of the gravity. There's so many things I think would be playful and fun, as well as experiential in a different way. And the fact that we'll be growing our own food, and it looks like we'll be having potentially insects as part of our food system. So we won't necessarily have cats and dogs, per se, in the first few crews, but to be able to interact with other living beings other than humans, it's amazing how life in any capacity, like growing things. I spend a lot of time out in the garden if I can, and there's something really quite connecting about being with your hands in the earth or in the dirt and touching living things in some way. So I'm not too concerned about that in some ways, because I think we'll find connection to other aspects of life and the life that we have around us and the life that we discover on Mars.
Oh, well, thanks. We're going to have to wrap up soon, so I'd like to get any last words from Oscar or Ryan as well.
Sure.
I'll add some things. So
okay, go ahead, Ryan.
Go ahead,
I
Ryan.
think at the end of the day, you have to weigh up all of the things that you stand to lose by going to Mars that you'll never get to experience again, with the unique aspects, things that no human has ever got to experience before. And the fact that you effectively get, particularly from a scientific standpoint, you get a magnification factor to what you can achieve as one of just one scientist amongst four people, or maybe even all four could be scientists, on a planet that no human has been to before. So I've always been fascinated by the question of whether there is life elsewhere in the universe. It's part of what motivates the research I do with exoplanets. And so to be there searching for evidence of life on Mars, I can't imagine really a greater contribution that I could make to science. And I'd certainly be willing to give up earthly comforts in order to make a contribution in that area. But the big thing that I think many people who criticize Mars One don't really, at least they might not be aware of as much, is the impact that Mars One is having already in terms of educational outreach in the sciences. Myself, and I know Diane is actually involved in this, as well as many of the other Mars One candidates, is we very often go into schools. We Skype schools all around the world. I've just come back from New Zealand, where I went to some schools, actually. And it's seeing how excited young people are by the prospects of human missions to Mars, and how the case study of Mars One, if the way I see it is that if I go into a class, and if even a single one of them is inspired to want to be a scientist when they grow up, then that more than justifies my own involvement to date in the project, and it's barely got started. So I think in many ways the best case scenario for Mars One succeeding is serving as a catalyst to inspire a new generation of young people to want to be scientists back here on the Earth.
Okay, Oscar, I guess you get the last word from the Mars One candidates.
Well, Paul, thanks for setting up this panel, and I think it's important to reiterate that humans are constantly looking for challenges. We need challenges to sharpen the edge of our spirit and to make sure we stay focused on what life is really about. I think Mars presents one of the biggest challenges that we can offer ourselves, and there are so many things that should be drawing us to Mars. I mean, all of the indications from our robotic explorers are showing us that there are increased concentrations of methane that can't be explained readily. That can't. We just recently discovered evidence of flowing salt water on the surface of Mars. or near subsurface. So all these things that, like Ryan said, could be indicative of habitats that life could flourish in, or that life could have flourished in, are all excellent reasons that we should be interested in going to this very alien planet that's not like Earth at all. It's one thing too to mention that the human population has about 20% of us that are genetically predisposed to explore, and if a real danger that humankind could be stuck in a very localized region, a very unexplored area, and would have never ventured out onto the unexplored areas of Earth, for example. So we need to embrace these people. We need to embrace the optimist. We need to carry with that optimism, a significant amount of realism. But at the same time, these aren't challenges that can't be overcome. Engineers and scientists are very good at what they do, and I think we just need to trust that if there's enough funding to do it safely, that this is a very noble goal for us to try and accomplish within our lifetimes. And again, thank you very much for this panel.
Yeah, well, thank you, Oscar. I'm impressed with how articulate all three of you guys are. And now Antonio has to leave, so I thought I'd let Antonio make one last comment if he wishes to.
I just want to wish you guys the best of luck. If you ever need anything from me, I've been looking at and studying Mars for a couple of years now. The bad news is I'm moving over to Europa starting next month, so that'll be my next cup of tea for a couple of years. I've got a buddy and I going to publish here something next year. Anyway, good panel. You guys, best of luck, and I hope everything works out.
Yeah, thanks, Antonio. By the way, Antonio is a suborbital astronaut candidate. I don't know if you guys knew that. His wife does a lot of videos called "An Astronaut's Wife." Yeah. So, what about you, Adam? Anything last words?
I love the Mars One. The concept of the mission is great. I have my own doubts about funding and the timeline, and I do have real doubts that you guys are ever actually going to get to Mars. It is a very noble thing to do, but I think it's just too much too soon, really. It's a shame, but I don't think it comes down to money to develop the technology, and it will get done eventually, but whether it gets done in the next, well, it certainly won't get done in the next 10 years. 20 years, who knows? 30 years, let's hope so. But then in 30 years' time, what will you guys be doing? Will you still want to go to Mars then? We'll see. I hope so. I'd love to see you on Mars. It would be great, but let's see. Let's see.
Okay, David.
Yes, thank you. It has been a good panel. I started out very much as a skeptic, and I'm still skeptical to some degree, but I've been impressed by the responses of the candidates and how well qualified they seem to be. And I also wish you luck, and it would be lovely to see it happen. But we'll keep our fingers crossed, and I hope I'm still around in 10 or 20 years' time when it actually does happen.
Yeah, I hope so too. Patrick.
Yeah, I got to say that I was one of the most outspoken ones about the timeline anyway. But I want to say that all of my questions have been answered before I even had the question that I did ask. So I was highly impressed. I didn't realize the levity of the credentials of all you candidates that were here today. Diane impressed me with. I didn't realize that you were also an educator and things like that. Oscar, I had no idea that you have such amazing military training in this test pilot and everything else. And of course, Ryan is not here, but he's obviously a scientist of great credentials. So I have, you have changed my mind. I'm still a bit skeptical on the timeline, but I've certainly been convinced that it is possible, at least to shoot for the timeline. Even if you miss the timeline, it certainly seems to be a doable thing. You seem to have thought. I had safety questions and stuff like that, but you answered those questions before I even had a chance to ask about them. So I'm very impressed. Thank you very much for entertaining our questions.
Hey, yeah, and I'd like to thank. Now it looks like we've lost Ryan, but I'd like to thank Diane, McGrath, Oscar Mathews, and Ryan MacDonald for joining us, and our panel. Antonio Paris, Adam Synergy Smith, David Grigg, and Patrick Festa. Now, next week is going to be kind of fun. Adam will be our host, and the topic is still open as far as I'm concerned. I won't be there. I'll be on my way down to Tennessee to visit my stepmom. And so you guys have fun and say smart things and make me proud of you. So now I want to just say about the usual things I always say, which is if you want to be on a panel for the Unseen podcast, you can be. It's not a private club. Just go to unseenpodcast.com. We'll have all the instructions there. Essentially, you join the Google Plus participants community, and every week you will get an invitation to a future episode, and you can decide right then and there if you want to be on the panel or not. And we select from those people that say yes, and who meet the psychological profile to be on that panel. So right now it's wide open for, I think, episode 30, which is going to feature a transhumanist, a practicing transhumanist, someone who will come on and tell us all about what it's like to have stuff inside your body that nature didn't put there. And that should be fun. 31st, we're going to have some fun. It'll be close to Halloween. We're going to talk about Bigfoot and other cryptids. And we have lots, and I think James will probably be the host for that. And we have other plans going way out through next year. And come join us, and we'd love to hear from you. Even if you don't want to be on a panel, let us know what you think. Go to unseenpodcast.com. If you have questions about Mars One or comments about Mars One, this will be episode 27. Go to the blog post for episode 27. Make your comments. If you have questions for this panel, I will try to get them to answer them. We may even have them back at some future time to update us on how things are going and what they think the future really is holding now that things have changed, and things will change, of course, as time goes on. There's a lot of people thinking about the architecture for Mars missions now. Just this week, there was the Planetary Society released their vision, Patrick briefly mentioned, which is called Orbit First, which involves going to Phobos. And we have the NASA vision. We have Elon Musk's plan and we have a bunch of other people weighing in on how we should all get to Mars. I don't think we're all going to land at the same time. There will be some winners, some losers, and some funded and some not funded. But I think we're in that period right now where we're having this conversation, and that's what I want us to have. I want to have this conversation, and this podcast plans to be part of that conversation. So thanks very much to everyone who joined us tonight. I have to say that the Mars One candidates who came on tonight were very impressive in terms of how well they thought through everything, and it's pretty clear that some of the public impression that has been given of the Mars One candidates is really unfair, and I think hopefully we can do a little bit to correct that. So again, unseenpodcast.com. Go there. If you can also email unseenpodcast@gmail.com if you have any questions, comments, concerns, criticisms. Also, remember, wowsignalpodcast.com. Go there for the latest Wow Signal stuff, which is our edited, scripted, carefully thought through program. And also, by the way, we are looking for someone to do a T-shirt for Unseen Podcast. So if you're a graphic designer, like to do T-shirts, please volunteer a few hours to help us do that. We'd love it. And we will see you next week. Actually, Adam will see you next week on the Unseen Podcast, which will be a little earlier than normal on the East Coast of the United States because it allows Adam not to have to stay up quite so late. And thank you, Adam, by the way. And then I will be back on the following week on the I believe that's to be the 16th of October for episode 29. So good night, everybody. We'll see you again soon.
Bye.
And